I gripped the safety line with numb fingers as another massive wave crashed over the deck of the Northern Passage. The icy water hammered against my waterproof gear, testing every seal and finding the weak points where the cold could seep in. 3 hours into our shift, and the Gulf of Alaska storm showed no signs of letting up. "Cable's coming loose on the forward container," Kevin shouted over the howling wind, pointing toward where a heavy securing chain had started to slip from its moorings. I nodded and made my way across the deck, careful to keep my balance as the ship pitched violently beneath me. Working cargo runs between Seattle and Anchorage meant dealing with these storms, but this one ranked among the worst I'd seen in my 4 years at sea. The massive container ship rose and fell with sickening regularity, making every step a calculated risk. "I got it," I called back, though my voice was mostly swallowed by the storm. Brian appeared beside me, his stocky frame providing stability against the wind as we both worked to resecure the chain. Rain pelted us sideways, driven by gusts that seemed determined to sweep us overboard. Brian's face was a mask of concentration as his gloved hands worked the mechanism with practiced efficiency. "Should hold now," he said, giving the chain a firm tug to test it. "How much longer on this shift, Tyler?" 4 more hours, I replied, checking my watch. The face was barely visible through the fog and rain, but I made out enough to know we weren't even halfway through. "Long night ahead." Brian nodded grimly and moved off to check another section. I took a moment to catch my breath, bracing against a secured container as the ship climbed another massive wave. The sea was a churning mass of black water, impossible to distinguish from the night sky except when lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the chaos in stark, blinding bursts. During one such flash, I saw something that made me doubt my eyes. About 50 yards off the starboard side, dark shapes stood on the surface of the water. Not floating, standing as if the churning sea beneath their feet was solid ground. I blinked away the rain, convinced I was seeing things. Another flash of lightning. They were still there. 5 or 6 human-like figures, completely motionless despite the violent waves that should have swallowed them instantly. They were facing our ship, watching with an unnatural stillness that felt wrong against the chaos surrounding us. "Kevin!" I called out, waving him over without taking my eyes off the impossible sight. "Do you see that?" Kevin made his way to me, grabbing the same railing for support. I pointed toward the figures. His eyes followed my gesture, and I watched as the color drained from his face. He immediately looked away, focusing intently on adjusting his gloves. "Ignore them," he said, his voice tight. "Just focus on the job." "What are they?" I asked, unable to tear my eyes away from the dark silhouettes that somehow maintained perfect balance on the rolling sea. Kevin shook his head sharply. "Bad luck to talk about it. Bad luck to even look." He turned away, moving back to his work with deliberate purpose. I remained transfixed, remembering whispered conversations in the crew quarters, stories traded during quiet night watches, tales of watchers that appeared during the worst storms. I'd always written them off as maritime superstition, the kind of ghost stories sailors had been telling for centuries. But there they stood, impossible and real. As I stared, one of the figures seemed to notice my attention. It was hard to make out details through the storm, but this one appeared to be a woman in what looked like tattered clothing. Even at this distance, I could feel an unnatural focus directed at me. Fear crystallized into something sharper, anger, maybe, or defiance. Who were these things to stand there watching us struggle against the elements? What right did they have to observe our suffering from their impossible perch? The words left my mouth before I could stop them. "Fuck off!" I shouted into the storm, the challenge rising from some primal place inside me. The moment the words escaped, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The storm seemed to pause for a heartbeat, not quieting, but shifting its attention. The woman-shaped figure stepped forward on the water, moving with a smooth glide that ignored the violent waves beneath her feet. "Shit," I whispered, backing away from the railing. She was coming toward our ship. Each step carried her closer with unnatural speed, her form becoming clearer as the distance closed. Brian was back at my side, looking confused. "What are you staring at?" he asked, following my gaze. "You don't see her?" My voice sounded strange in my own ears. Brian squinted into the storm. See what? The waves? Before I could answer, she reached the hull of our ship. I expected her to stop, but she continued upward, climbing the vertical surface with the same impossible ease with which she had walked on water. Her movements were fluid, untouched by gravity or physics. "This isn't happening," I muttered, backing away as her hand appeared over the railing, followed by another. She pulled herself onto the deck with graceful precision. The storm continued to rage around us, but she stood completely still, water streaming off her tattered dress without seeming to touch her. Her long, dark hair hung in wet ropes around her face, obscuring her features. Kevin had noticed her now. He stood frozen nearby, his eyes wide with recognition and fear. Brian looked between us, clearly seeing our reactions, but not what caused them. "What's wrong with you two?" he asked, his voice rising with concern. The woman turned her face toward me, and her hair parted enough for me to see what lay beneath. Where eyes should have been were empty, hollow sockets. Not just missing eyes, but deeply carved absences that seemed to tunnel impossibly far into her skull. The rest of her face was worse, torn flesh that exposed bone and gristle, portions of cheek and jaw visible through ragged holes in her skin. Yet somehow, I knew with absolute certainty that she was looking directly at me. She didn't move or speak. She simply stood on the heaving deck with perfect balance, her ruined face turned in my direction, those hollow sockets somehow fixing me with an awareness that felt more penetrating than any eyes could have managed. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The storm continued to rage around us, waves crashing over the deck, wind howling between the containers, but she remained perfectly still, locked in place like she was anchored to something far more substantial than our pitching ship. And all I could think was that I had called her here. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the wet deck as pure instinct took over. The eyeless woman didn't move, but her presence sent waves of wrongness washing over me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I knew was I needed to get away. Without saying another word to Kevin or Brian, I turned and ran. The safety line pulled taut against my harness until I fumbled with the clip, releasing it with shaking fingers. The ship pitched violently beneath me as I sprinted between the massive cargo containers, nearly falling several times as waves crashed across the deck. My boots pounded against metal stairs as I climbed toward the bridge, driven by blind panic. I glanced back once, terrified I'd see her gliding after me with that impossible fluid movement. The deck behind me was empty except for Kevin and Brian, both still frozen where I'd left them. I burst through the door to the bridge, gasping for breath. Captain Marshall stood calmly reviewing navigational charts spread across the central console. He looked up at my entrance, his weathered face betraying only mild surprise at my disheveled appearance. "Captain," I wheezed, trying to catch my breath. "There's a woman on the deck with no eyes." My words tumbled out between ragged breaths. I pointed frantically back toward where I'd come from, expecting alarm, action, something that matched the terror churning in my gut. But Captain Marshall's expression never changed. "Return to your duties, Anderson," Marshall said, cutting me off. His voice was steady, almost bored, as if I'd reported a minor maintenance issue rather than an impossible horror. I stared at him, certain he hadn't understood me. "Sir, there's something on this ship, something that walked on water and then climbed straight up the hull. She has no eyes, just holes going back into her skull." Marshall sighed, setting down his pencil and turning his full attention to me. "She'll leave when she's ready." The casual tone hit me like a bucket of ice water. He knew. Not just about these things in general. He knew exactly what I was talking about. The realization made me dizzy. "You've seen them before," I said quietly. "Go back to work, Tyler." There was something in his steady gaze, not fear, but knowledge, weighted by experience. The storm is still active and those containers need securing. Ignore her completely and continue your duties. I wanted to argue, to demand answers about what we were dealing with, but something in the captain's unwavering confidence made me hesitate. He'd been sailing these waters for 30 years. If he wasn't worried... "Yes, sir," I said finally. As I turned to leave, Marshall added, "And next time, don't engage with them. Ever." The reprimand was clear. He knew what I'd done, how I'd challenged her. I nodded stiffly and left the bridge, my mind racing with questions I suddenly didn't want answered. The wind hit me full force as I stepped back onto the exposed deck. The storm continued to rage, though it seemed slightly less violent than before. I clipped my safety line back to the guideline and made my way carefully toward where Kevin and Brian were working. They both looked up as I approached. Kevin's face was pale, his movements mechanical as he checked and rechecked a perfectly secure tie-down. Brian looked confused and concerned, glancing between Kevin and me as if trying to piece together what was happening. "Captain says to continue our duties," I told them, trying to keep my voice steady. Kevin nodded without meeting my eyes. "Told you not to talk about them," he muttered. Brian frowned. "What the hell is going on with you two?" I opened my mouth to explain, then closed it again, remembering Marshall's words. "Just some weather concerns," I lied. "Let's finish securing this section." As I turned toward my workstation, I saw her. She had moved while I was gone, now standing just a few feet from where I needed to be. Her tattered dress hung motionless despite the violent wind, water streaming around rather than on her. Those hollow sockets were turned directly toward me. I forced myself to move past her, keeping my eyes fixed on the equipment I needed to check. My hands shook as I tested the tension on a cargo strap, hyper-aware of her presence just beyond my peripheral vision. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I remembered the captain's calm demeanor. He'd seen this before. He knew what to do, so I worked. For the next several hours, I moved through my responsibilities in a state of numb determination. The woman followed me, always maintaining the same distance, her ruined face constantly turned in my direction. I never acknowledged her directly, but I couldn't help noticing her movements, the way she would glide rather than step, her feet never quite seeming to touch the deck. Kevin worked with the same forced focus, his eyes never straying in her direction. Brian continued to look perplexed, clearly sensing our discomfort but unable to see the cause. He kept shooting us confused glances, occasionally asking what was wrong, but eventually gave up when neither of us would explain. "The barometer's rising," Brian said at one point, checking the weather instruments. "Storm might be breaking soon." I nodded mechanically, not trusting myself to speak. As if responding to his observation, the wind began to ease slightly. The massive waves still rocked the ship, but their violence was diminishing. Under normal circumstances, this would have brought relief. Instead, the lessening chaos of the storm only made her presence more noticeable, more wrong. As the rain slackened from torrential to merely heavy, I found myself at the starboard rail, checking the security of a problematic container stack. I tried to focus on the task, but my awareness of her standing just behind me made my skin crawl. Without meaning to, I glanced over my shoulder. She stood less than 3 feet away. Water ran down the deck around her feet, dividing and flowing as if she were a stone in a stream. Her head tilted slightly as I looked at her, those hollow sockets somehow conveying attention, expectation even. I quickly looked away, my heart pounding. The remaining hours of my shift stretched into what felt like days. The storm continued to weaken, the ship's violent pitching gradually easing into a more manageable role. But as the natural threat diminished, her presence seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. Every time I moved to a new task, she followed, always watching, always silent. I found myself wondering what she wanted. Why me? Was it because I had shouted at her? Or would she have chosen someone else if I hadn't drawn her attention? The question circled in my mind without answers as I worked, my movements becoming increasingly mechanical as exhaustion set in. 2 more hours, Kevin muttered as we passed each other while checking different sections of the deck. He looked utterly drained, the fear having given way to a kind of resigned weariness. I nodded in acknowledgement, too tired for words. The sky had begun to lighten almost imperceptibly in the east, the promise of dawn offering little comfort. The woman stood at the edge of my work area, her ruined face turned toward me with that same terrible awareness. As I worked, I tried to make sense of the situation. Captain Marshall knew about these watchers. He had rules for dealing with them, and somehow, breaking those rules, as I had done, brought consequences. But what did they want? Why stand on water watching ships struggle through storms? Why board our vessel but do nothing except follow me around? The questions had no answers. only the constant, silent presence of the woman with the hollow eyes, watching my every move as the night dragged on. I trudged below deck as the first hints of dawn crept across the horizon, my body aching from the long night shift. The storm had finally begun to ease, but exhaustion weighed on me like an anchor. All I wanted was to collapse into my bunk and let sleep wash everything away. The storm, the fear, and especially her. But she followed me. I felt her presence before I saw her, that cold prickling at the back of my neck that told me I wasn't alone. When I glanced back down the narrow corridor, she was there, gliding silently behind me with the same terrible grace she'd shown all night. The metal flooring that creaked and groaned beneath my heavy boots made no sound under her feet. I quickened my pace, desperate to reach my small cabin. Some irrational part of me hoped that closing the door would somehow keep her out, that the thin metal barrier might mean something to a being who could walk on water and climb vertical surfaces. I fumbled with the handle, my fingers clumsy with exhaustion and fear, and practically fell inside. The cabin was barely large enough for a narrow bunk, a small desk bolted to the wall, and a locker for my few belongings. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, breathing hard. For one blissful moment, I was alone with the familiar sounds of the ship, the distant hum of engines, the creak of metal as we cut through increasingly calm seas. Then I turned around. She stood in the corner beside my desk, her ruined face turned toward me, those hollow sockets somehow tracking my movements. I bit back a scream and pressed myself against the door, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you want?" I whispered. She gave no response, no movement, no acknowledgement that I'd spoken at all. Just that terrible stillness, that empty gaze. I slid down the door until I sat on the floor, drawing my knees up to my chest. Sleep seemed impossible now, but I needed rest desperately. My mind wandered back to the bridge, to Captain Marshall's calm acceptance. "She'll leave when she's ready," he'd said. But when would that be? What was she waiting for? I must have dozed off despite everything, because I jerked awake sometime later, still sitting against the door. She hadn't moved, still standing in that same corner, still watching me with her eyeless gaze. I climbed unsteadily to my feet and stripped off my wet gear, hanging it on the hooks by the door. She watched me change into dry clothes, her attention never wavering. I crawled into my bunk, fully clothed, and pulled the thin blanket over my head like a child hiding from monsters. It was a useless gesture. I knew she was still there, could feel her presence even if I couldn't see her. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of her ruined face appeared in my mind. Those hollow sockets somehow more penetrating than any eyes could be. Sleep came in fits and starts, never lasting more than a few minutes before I'd jerk awake, certain she'd moved closer. But each time I looked, she remained in the same spot, that same terrible stillness, that same empty gaze fixed on me. Morning light eventually filtered through the small porthole, casting weak shadows across my cabin. I opened my eyes after another brief, restless sleep and immediately looked toward the corner where she had stood all night. It was empty. Relief flooded through me so intensely that I nearly wept. I sat up quickly, checking every corner of the tiny space, but she was truly gone. I laughed shakily, running my hands through my hair. Maybe Captain Marshall had been right. She had left when she was ready. I checked my watch. I had managed maybe 3 hours of broken sleep, but there was no way I could stay in the cabin any longer. I needed fresh air, needed to see other people, needed to confirm that the nightmare was over. I grabbed my jacket and made my way through the ship's corridors, noting how different they felt in daylight without her silent presence behind me. The storm had completely passed overnight, and the ship had settled into a more familiar rhythm of movement through calm seas. When I reached the deck, sunlight temporarily blinded me. The sky was clear blue, not a cloud in sight. After the violence of the previous night, the tranquility seemed almost surreal. Several crew members moved about their duties, their expressions unusually tense despite the perfect weather. Something was wrong. I made my way toward the bow, where Samuel Wright, our engineer, stood at the rail looking out at the water. His face wore a puzzled frown, and he kept checking something on a handheld device, tapping it as if it weren't working properly. "What's going on?" I asked, joining him at the rail. Samuel glanced at me, his frown deepening. Ship won't move. Engines are running at full power, propellers are turning, but we're just sitting here. I looked out at the water. He was right. The sea was unusually calm, almost glassy, with barely a ripple disturbing its surface. Despite the distant hum of engines and the vibration I could feel through the deck, we weren't making any headway. "How long has this been happening?" I asked. "Since about an hour ago. We were making good progress toward anchorage after the storm cleared. Then suddenly, nothing. Like we hit an invisible wall." He tapped his device again. "GPS is down too, just giving error messages. And look at this." He pulled out a pocket compass and held it in his palm. I watched as the needle spun wildly, never settling on any direction. Samuel shook his head. "Never seen anything like it. All navigation systems are haywire. Captain's got everyone checking for equipment failures, but so far, everything seems to be working normally. We just can't move." From the bridge, I could hear Captain Marshall's voice barking orders. Crew members hustled about with a sense of controlled urgency. The calm after the storm should have been a relief, but this unnatural stillness brought its own kind of tension. "We should be making headway toward anchorage," Samuel muttered, staring out at the water again. "Clear weather, calm seas. We should be cruising at full speed. Instead, we're just stuck." I scanned the horizon, taking in the empty expanse of ocean surrounding us. The morning sun glinted off the water, turning it into a vast mirror that reflected the cloudless sky. Beautiful, serene, and completely wrong. Then I saw her. About 50 yards off the starboard side, a dark figure stood on the water's surface. Even at this distance, I recognized her immediately. The tattered dress, the long, wet hair, the unnatural stillness that defied the gentle swells beneath her feet. My blood turned cold. "Samuel," I said quietly, "do you see anything out there?" "About 50 yards to starboard." He squinted against the sun, following my gaze. "Just water." "Why? You see something?" I didn't answer. The woman stood facing our ship, her hollow-socketed face turned directly toward us. No, not toward us, toward me. Even without eyes, I could feel her attention fixed specifically on me, just as it had been all night. And in that moment, I knew with sick certainty that she was the reason we couldn't move. This wasn't over. Whatever game she was playing, whatever purpose she had in following me, it hadn't been satisfied by tormenting me through the night. Now she was holding an entire ship hostage, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all because of my challenge during the storm. Captain Marshall appeared at the rail nearby, a pair of binoculars in his hands as he surveyed the surrounding water. His weathered face betrayed nothing, but the tight set of his jaw told me he was concerned. "Sir," I called, approaching him. "I need to talk to you." Marshall lowered the binoculars and turned to me, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in my exhausted appearance. "Not now, Anderson. We're dealing with some equipment issues." "It's not equipment, sir," I said, lowering my voice so Samuel couldn't hear. "It's her, the woman from last night. She's out there on the water." Marshall's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. He raised the binoculars again, scanning the area where I'd seen her. "You see her too, don't you?" I pressed. He lowered the binoculars slowly, his gaze still fixed on that distant point. "Yes," he said simply, his voice barely audible. "I do." The confirmation sent a chill through me. What does she want? Why can't anyone else see her? Marshall turned to me, his expression grave. "Some can. Those who've had encounters before. Those who've broken the rules." He paused, studying me. "You challenged her last night, didn't you? Spoke to her directly?" The memory of my shouted defiance flooded back. "I told her to fuck off," I admitted. "I didn't know." "No, you didn't," Marshall cut me off sharply. "And now we're all paying the price." He tucked the binoculars under his arm and glanced around at the crew members working nearby. "Continue helping with the systems checks. Act normal. We'll discuss this further when we know more." As he walked away, I turned back to the water, to the distant figure standing on its surface. She hadn't moved, hadn't changed position at all. Just watching, waiting. What did she want from me? What would it take to make her leave us alone? I rejoined Samuel at the rail, trying to appear focused on the problem at hand rather than the supernatural cause I now knew was behind it. "Compass still spinning?" I asked, forcing a casual tone. Samuel nodded, frustration evident in his expression. "Nothing makes sense. GPS still down, radio communication spotty. It's like we've fallen into some kind of dead zone." I looked out at the woman standing on the water, invisible to most of the crew but terrifyingly real to me. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Something like that." I stood at the rail, watching the woman on the water while Samuel continued checking his malfunctioning equipment. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its warmth doing nothing to ease the cold dread settling in my stomach. She hadn't moved an inch since I'd first spotted her, that same terrible stillness that defied the natural world. "All hands on deck," Captain Marshall's voice boomed over the ship's PA system. "Emergency meeting in 5 minutes." Samuel tucked his compass into his pocket with a frustrated sigh. Maybe the captain's got some answers. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I knew exactly why we were stuck, but explaining that to Samuel would be pointless. He couldn't see what I saw. Crew members emerged from various parts of the ship, gathering near the center of the main deck. I spotted Kevin and Brian among them, Kevin's face drawn and pale as he deliberately kept his eyes away from the starboard side where the woman stood watching. Brian looked merely confused and irritated, scanning the clear sky as if searching for signs of another storm. Captain Marshall appeared from the bridge, his weathered face set in hard lines. He stood before us, hands clasped behind his back, feet planted firmly despite the gentle roll of the ship. His posture radiated authority, even as confusion spread among the crew. "As you're all aware," he began, his voice carrying easily across the deck, "we've encountered an unusual situation. Despite all systems functioning normally, we are unable to make headway toward anchorage." Murmurs rippled through the assembled crew. Samuel stepped forward. "Sir, I've checked the engines 3 times. They're running at full capacity, but it's like we're pushing against a wall." Marshall nodded. "Navigation systems?" "Still down," Samuel replied. "GPS is giving error messages. Compasses won't settle on north. It's like we're in some kind of magnetic anomaly, but that wouldn't explain why we can't move." The captain surveyed the crew, his gaze lingering briefly on me before moving on. "We'll be conducting a full systems check. Every mechanical and electrical component on this vessel needs to be tested and verified. Wright, organize the engineering team. Torres, check the hull for any external impediments. Garcia, assist with navigation equipment diagnostics." Kevin, Brian, and Samuel nodded, accepting their assignments without question. "What about me, sir?" I asked, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. Marshall's eyes met mine, and I saw that same flicker of knowledge I'd noticed earlier. "Anderson, you'll assist me with external observations. The rest of you, report findings hourly." Dismissed. The crew dispersed quickly, breaking into smaller groups to tackle their assigned tasks. Kevin shot me a nervous glance before hurrying away with Brian. I remained where I stood, waiting for the captain to speak. Marshall didn't waste time. "Walk with me," he said quietly, leading me toward the starboard rail, directly facing where the woman stood on the water. We stood side by side, looking out at the unnaturally calm sea. The woman remained exactly as before, her hollow-socketed face turned toward us. "You see her?" I said. It wasn't a question. "I do." Marshall kept his voice low, though no one else was within earshot. "Not everyone can. Only those who've had encounters before." "Like Kevin," I said, remembering his reaction during the storm. Marshall nodded. "Garcia had his own run-in 2 years ago. Nearly quit after that voyage. But Brian can't see her. Count him lucky." The captain's weathered hands gripped the rail, his knuckles whitening slightly. "Those who can't see them live much simpler lives at sea." I glanced at the crew members bustling around the deck, checking systems and running diagnostics that would yield no solutions. "We're wasting time with all these tests, aren't we? She's the reason we can't move." Marshall didn't answer immediately. He studied the distant figure with a practiced eye, as if assessing a common navigational hazard rather than an impossible being standing on water. "These waters have their own rules," he finally said. "Their own inhabitants. Most sailors go their entire careers without encountering them. Some aren't so fortunate." I thought about the whispered stories I'd heard in the crew quarters, the superstitions I'd dismissed as nonsense until facing the reality myself. "What are they?" I asked. Marshall shook his head. "Names have power. Better not to label things we don't understand." He turned to me, his expression hardening. "What matters is respecting the boundaries. You crossed one last night." The weight of his words sank into me. When I yelled at her, "They watch from a distance. That's their right. That's the natural order." His voice took on an edge I'd never heard before. "You challenged that order." Guilt and fear twisted in my gut. "I didn't know." "No, you didn't." His tone softened slightly. "But ignorance doesn't protect us from consequences." For the next 2 hours, I helped coordinate the crew's troubleshooting efforts, knowing they were futile but unable to explain why. Samuel reported that the engines continued to run perfectly. Brian confirmed there were no physical obstructions around the hull. Kevin's inspection of the navigation systems showed everything was in working order despite the strange readings. All the while, the woman remained on the water's surface, watching me with those hollow sockets. I could feel her attention like a physical weight pressing against my skin, even when my back was turned. The morning stretched toward noon, the sun climbing higher in the cloudless sky. Frustration grew among the crew as each test revealed nothing wrong with the ship itself. Marshall maintained his stoic composure, but I could see the tightness around his eyes, the slight clench of his jaw. Kevin approached me as I checked a readout near the starboard rail, keeping his voice low. "It's her, isn't it? The one from last night." I nodded slightly, careful not to let others overhear. "What does she want?" he asked, deliberately not looking toward the water. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think I'm the reason she's here." Kevin's face paled further. "You shouldn't have acknowledged her. That's the first rule." "There are rules?" I asked, surprised. He looked at me like I was crazy. "Of course there are rules. How else do you think we survive out here?" He glanced around nervously before continuing. "Never look directly at them. Never speak about them on deck. And never, ever address them directly." I swallowed hard, remembering my shouted challenge during the storm. "I broke that last one." "Yeah, you did." Kevin's voice held no accusation, just weary acceptance. "And now, we're all paying for it." He walked away before I could respond, leaving me with the growing weight of responsibility. I'd caused this, all of this, with my impulsive anger. The crew regrouped near the bow as the 2-hour mark approached. Marshall listened to their reports with a grim expression that deepened as each person confirmed finding nothing wrong with the ship. "So we've got engines running at full capacity, propellers turning normally, no obstructions, and yet we remain perfectly stationary," Samuel summarized, frustration evident in his voice. "It doesn't make sense." "Could be some kind of underwater current," Kevin suggested, carefully avoiding looking at me. "Something holding us in place." Brian shook his head. I checked the water flow around the hull. It's completely normal. If there was a current strong enough to hold us stationary, we'd see disturbances in the water. More theories were tossed around. Electromagnetic anomalies, equipment failures too subtle to detect, even the possibility of uncharted underwater structures. Each was quickly dismissed as the evidence failed to support it. Through it all, I kept glancing at the woman on the water, her presence a constant reminder of my mistake. Marshall caught me looking and gave an almost imperceptible nod. As the crew's theories grew increasingly far-fetched, I worked up my courage and approached the captain. "Sir," I said quietly, "I need to speak with you." Marshall stepped away from the group with me, his expression unreadable. I pointed discreetly toward the figure on the water. "Sir, I think she's the reason we can't move." Marshall studied the woman for a long moment, then turned to me with a grim expression. "You brought her aboard. You need to fix this." The weight of responsibility crashed down on me. The entire ship, the crew, our cargo, our schedule, all of it was being held hostage because of my actions. How? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marshall's eyes hardened. You challenged her. Now you need to make it right. I understood what he meant, though everything in me rebelled against the idea. Apologizing to that thing with its hollow eye sockets and torn face went against every instinct I had. But I'd seen what she could do, walking on water, climbing vertical surfaces, holding an entire cargo ship immobile through sheer will. I nodded stiffly and walked to the starboard rail, aware of the captain watching me. The rest of the crew had noticed our exchange and fallen silent, their eyes following me with confusion or suspicion. My hands shook as I gripped the cold metal rail. The woman stood perfectly still on the water's surface, her hollow sockets somehow focused on me across the distance. Those horrible empty spaces seemed to draw me in, tunneling impossibly far into her skull. I forced myself not to look away. Taking a deep breath, I called out across the water, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have told you to fuck off." My words echoed across the calm sea, carrying clearly in the still air. Behind me, I heard confused murmurs from crew members who couldn't see what I was addressing. Someone, Brian, I thought, asked what the hell I was doing. For a moment, nothing happened. The woman remained motionless, her ruined face turned toward me, those empty sockets fixed on mine. The woman's ruined face slowly twisted into what might have been a smile. The torn flesh stretched across her exposed jaw and cheekbone, pulling in ways that defied natural movement. My stomach clenched and bile rose in my throat. Her acknowledgement of my apology was somehow worse than her blank stare had been. That empty, unnerving attention had been bad enough, but this response, this horrible parody of human expression, made my skin crawl. I gripped the rail tighter to keep my hands from shaking, fighting the overwhelming urge to look away from her. Behind me, the confused murmurs of the crew grew louder as they watched me apparently talking to empty water. "What the hell is Anderson doing?" someone whispered. "Lost his damn mind," another voice replied. I ignored them, keeping my focus on the woman. Her smile widened unnaturally, the gash that formed her mouth splitting further across her face. Then, without any fanfare or dramatic gesture, she simply faded. Like morning mist burning away under sunlight, her form grew transparent, less substantial, until nothing remained but calm water where she had stood. The moment she disappeared, the ship's systems erupted with activity. Alarms and notifications sounded from the bridge, and the control panels around the deck lit up with blinking indicators. The navigation displays that had been dark suddenly flickered to life. "GPS is back online," Samuel's voice called up from below deck. "Compasses are working again." I looked down at the pocket compass Samuel had shown me earlier. The needle, which had been spinning wildly, now settled firmly toward north. The ship gave a sudden lurch beneath my feet, nearly causing me to lose my balance. The engines, which had been running futilely for hours, finally found purchase in the water. We began to move forward, cutting through the calm sea toward our destination. Captain Marshall stepped up beside me at the rail, his weathered face giving nothing away as he looked out at the now empty water. "Well done," he said quietly, for my ears only. Then, turning to the crew, his voice shifted to its familiar commanding tone. "Everyone back to your stations. We've got lost time to make up for." The crew scattered, returning to their duties with obvious relief. The tension that had gripped the ship all morning began to dissipate, replaced by the comfortable rhythm of normal operations. But as I moved away from the rail, I noticed something had changed. The way they looked at me was different now. Kevin kept his distance, his face still pale as he busied himself with equipment checks. When our eyes met briefly across the deck, he quickly looked away, his movements becoming unnecessarily focused on coiling a length of rope. Brian approached Kevin, and they bent their heads together in hushed conversation. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but both men glanced in my direction several times, their expressions a mix of confusion and wariness. Brian looked baffled, while Kevin seemed almost afraid. Samuel emerged from below deck, clipboard in hand, looking pleased that his equipment was functioning properly again. "Whatever that magnetic anomaly was, it's gone now," he announced to the captain, passing right by me as if I weren't there. "All systems nominal. We should reach anchorage on schedule if we maintain current speed." Throughout the afternoon, I went about my duties with mechanical precision, trying to ignore the sidelong glances and whispered comments that followed me around the ship. The crew gave me a wider berth than usual, conversations pausing when I walked by only to resume in hushed tones after I'd passed. I caught fragments. Talking to thin air. Captain letting him stay on duty. Something happened during the storm. I tried to focus on my work instead. The weather remained perfect, with clear skies and calm seas making our journey north smooth and uneventful. By all appearances, we were just a cargo vessel making a routine trip to anchorage. Nothing suggested we'd spent the morning trapped by a supernatural entity that most of the crew couldn't even see. Yet the memory of her hollow eye sockets stayed with me, along with the knowledge that I had somehow broken a boundary between our world and whatever realm she inhabited. I had called her to our ship with my challenge, and only my apology had set us free again. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself occasionally scanning the water's surface, half expecting to see her standing there again. But the sea remained empty of anything but gentle waves and the occasional seabird. Kevin finally approached me as I checked the tie-downs on a row of containers. He glanced around first, making sure we were alone. "You fixed it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not looking up from my work. "She's gone. For now." Kevin's hands fidgeted with his work gloves. "They always come back during storms, but at least we're moving again." I straightened up, meeting his eyes. "You've seen them before." He nodded, looking uncomfortable. 2 years ago. Not like you did, though. I just saw them standing on the water. He swallowed hard. I never spoke to one. Never had one come aboard. Never had to apologize to one. The way he said it made it clear he thought I'd done something extraordinary and extraordinarily dangerous. "The captain knew what to do," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Kevin laughed, a short, harsh sound with no humor in it. "Of course he did. Marshall's been sailing these waters for decades. He knows all the rules." Rules. I remembered how both Kevin and the captain had mentioned rules before. Kevin looked around again, then lowered his voice even further. "There are ways to survive out here when they show up. Things you should never do. Marshall knows them all." He tugged his gloves back on. "You should ask him about it." Before I could press him for more information, he walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. The sun began to dip toward the horizon as evening approached, casting long shadows across the deck. The coastline had become visible in the distance, and the lights of anchorage would soon appear on the horizon. We'd been making good speed since breaking free of whatever force had held us stationary. I was checking the manifest for our cargo delivery when I felt a presence behind me. I turned to find Captain Marshall standing there, his expression unusually serious, even for him. The fading light cast deep shadows across his weathered face, making him look older than his 53 years. "Anderson," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "when you're finished here, meet me on the port side. There are things we need to discuss." The weight in his words told me this wasn't about regular ship's business. This was about what had happened, about the woman, the watchers, and whatever rules I had broken and then somehow made right again. I nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Marshall gave a curt nod and walked away, his posture straight and commanding as always. But there was something different in his manner, a gravity I hadn't noticed before. Whatever he wanted to discuss, it was important. I finished my checks and made my way to the port side of the ship, away from where most of the crew was working. The captain stood at the rail, looking out toward the approaching coastline. The lights of anchorage had just begun to twinkle in the distance, small points of brightness against the darkening landscape. As I approached, I couldn't help wondering what he was about to tell me and why my encounter with the eyeless woman seemed to have changed everything. I joined Captain Marshall at the portside rail, where he stood watching the distant lights of anchorage that sparkled against the darkening landscape. The air had grown cooler as evening settled in, carrying the faint scent of land, a mix of pine and soil that contrasted with the clean salt air we'd breathed for days. Neither of us spoke for a moment, both watching as the coast drew gradually closer. "I'm promoting you to first mate," Marshall said without preamble, his eyes still fixed on the approaching shoreline. The statement caught me completely off guard. I opened my mouth to thank him, but he held up his hand, stopping me before I could speak. The previous first mate, David Clark, disappeared 3 months ago after an encounter with those figures. His voice remained matter-of-fact, as if discussing a routine personnel change rather than someone's disappearance. He broke one of the rules. My mind raced back to the eyeless woman who had stood on the water, who had climbed our ship, who had followed me through corridors and into my cabin. The crew had mentioned David Clark in passing during my first weeks aboard the Northern Passage, but always in hushed tones that cut off whenever officers approached. Rules, I repeated, remembering how both Kevin and Marshall had mentioned them before. Kevin said there are ways to survive when they show up. Marshall nodded, reaching inside his jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges soft from handling, creased along well-worn folds. He handed it to me without ceremony. "These are the rules," he said simply. I unfolded the paper carefully. The surface was covered in neat, precise handwriting. 6 numbered items, each written with the careful deliberation of someone who knew their importance. I read through them slowly. 1. Never acknowledge their presence directly. Do not point, stare, or speak about them while on deck. 2. If one notices you, do not make eye contact. Look past them, through them, or at the deck. 3. Never address them directly. No challenges, no questions, no conversation. 4. If one comes aboard, maintain your duties. Do not run. Do not hide. Act as if nothing is amiss. 5. Never invite them aboard verbally or with gestures. Do not extend hospitality of any kind. 6. If you break rules 1 to 5, make amends before the next tide change or forfeit your place in this world. Each one, Marshall said as I looked up from the list, represents lessons learned the hard way. Sailors who didn't come back, ships that never made port. He tapped the paper with a weathered finger. David thought some rules were more important than others. He was wrong. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of what Marshall was telling me. Which one did he break? Number 5. Marshall replied, looking back toward the water. We had a watcher on board during a storm. David thought he could bargain with it, offer it something to protect the ship. I folded the paper carefully along its original creases, my fingers tracing the edges that David Clark's hands had likely touched as well. What happened to him? Marshall's face remained impassive, but something in his eyes darkened. Next morning, his bunk was empty. His gear was still there, but he was gone. No trace, like he just stepped out of our world. The casual way he delivered this information made it more disturbing, not less. The matter-of-fact tone suggested this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. As first mate, Marshall continued, you'll be responsible for teaching these rules to new crew members, making sure everyone knows how to survive when the watchers appear. His eyes met mine with fierce intensity. These aren't suggestions, Anderson. They're the difference between making it home and vanishing into the fog. I tucked the paper into my pocket, feeling it press against my thigh like a stone. The promotion should have been a moment of pride, a step forward in my career. Instead, it felt like being handed a burden I hadn't asked for. Why me? I asked, the question escaping before I could think better of it. Marshall turned his gaze back to the water. You broke Rule 3. You challenged her directly. A hint of something almost like respect crept into his voice. But then you fixed it, made amends. The ship started moving again. That tells me you've got what it takes. The ship's engines hummed beneath our feet, the vibrations a comforting reminder that we were indeed moving, heading toward the safety of harbor. Soon we'd dock, unload our cargo, and the crew would disperse into anchorage for a brief respite before our return journey. Not everyone can see them, Marshall added after a pause. Kevin can. I can. Most of the crew can't, and that's probably for the best. But those of us who can need to understand what we're dealing with. He looked at me again. Do you accept the position? I thought about declining, about asking for a transfer to another route, another ship, anywhere that didn't involve eyeless women standing on water. But something in me knew this was no longer an option. I had crossed a boundary and couldn't uncross it. I'd seen things that had changed me irrevocably. Yes, sir, I said. I accept. Marshall nodded once, a gesture of finality. Good. When we dock, I'll file the paperwork. Your new duties start when we leave port tomorrow evening. The ship's horn sounded, a deep bellowing note announcing our approach to Anchorage Harbor. Lights from the port facilities grew brighter as we drew closer to shore. Around us, crew members moved with renewed purpose, preparing for docking procedures. There's one more thing you should know, Marshall said, lowering his voice slightly. These waters are different from others. There are things out here that don't appear on any chart, don't follow any laws of nature we understand. The Watchers are just one kind. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the evening air. There are others. Marshall's expression remained unchanged. In time, you'll learn. For now, focus on the rules. He straightened up, adjusting his jacket. You've got a good instinct, Anderson. Trust it. He extended his hand and I shook it, feeling the calluses of decades at sea against my palm. Thank you, sir, I managed. Marshall gave a curt nod before turning away, calling out docking instructions to the crew on the foredeck. I remained at the rail for a moment longer, my hand resting on the pocket that held the rules. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the lives it had tried to save and those it had failed to protect, like David Clark. As we pulled into the harbor, the ship's powerful engines eased, our speed dropping as we navigated toward our assigned berth. The lights of Anchorage surrounded us now, bright windows and street lamps creating a bubble of human civilization against the vast Alaskan wilderness beyond. People moved about on the docks, small figures going about their normal lives, unaware of what lurked in the waters just beyond their sight. I thought about the eyeless woman, about her impossible movements and her terrible stillness. I thought about standing on solid ground in a few hours, drinking a beer in a normal bar surrounded by normal people with normal concerns. And I knew that even then, part of me would be looking out at the water, wondering if she was out there, watching and waiting for our return journey. Anderson! Brian's voice broke through my thoughts. Captain says you're to oversee the port side mooring. Everything all right? I turned to face him, noticing how he still looked at me with lingering confusion from earlier events. He was one of the lucky ones who couldn't see them, who would never understand what had really happened today. Everything's fine, I said, pulling myself back to the present moment. Let's get this ship docked. As I moved across the deck, issuing instructions and checking equipment, I felt the weight of responsibility settling onto my shoulders. I wasn't just responsible for cargo and scheduling anymore. Now I carried the rules that kept people alive, that kept them from vanishing like David Clark had. The northern passage eased against the dock with a gentle bump, and crew members hurried to secure mooring lines. I felt the subtle shift as our connection to land was established, tethering us to the solid world once more. But as I glanced back out toward the open water beyond the harbor, I knew my life had changed forever. I was bound now to these waters, to this ship, and to protecting my crew from forces beyond normal understanding. The paper in my pocket crinkled as I moved, reminding me of its presence. 6 rules to survive the Watchers, 6 rules that now fell to me to enforce. I wondered, as the gangway lowered to the dock, how many more rules there were for the other things Captain Marshall had hinted at, the other entities lurking in these waters, waiting for someone to make a fatal mistake.